The Scottish Greens support workers, retail workers, hospitality workers, healthcare workers, care workers, and yes, sex workers, because sex work is work. It might not be work one agrees with. It might not be work one would ever do. One might not ever procure the services of a sex worker. But some people do that work. Many of them do it out of their own free will. They find it meaningful and fulfilling work. It earns them a good living and puts food on their table. I do accept that this is not the case for all. For those who turn to sex work out of sheer desperation, there should be clear supports in place to allow them to get out of that work into a job they actually want to do. We cannot and we must not ignore the systemic barriers that drive some people into sex work they would prefer not to do. Poverty, disability, caring responsibilities, and a lack of viable alternatives. But we also cannot legislate these issues away by punishing clients and, by extension, workers. And those who coerce or traffic sex workers should feel the full force of the law. But for those who do this work, do it freely and get value from it, who are we to make it harder and less safe to do? We should never make policy without listening to those who it impacts, and the vast majority of workers are against criminalising the purchase of sex. I'll take an intervention from Ruth
Maguire briefly.
Do a brief intervention. If prostitution is work like any other, should we be offering it as work experience for young people? Should folk who are going for job seekers, should their benefits be taken away if they refuse to do it?
Maggie Chapman.
I thank Ruth Maguire for that intervention. It is a different kind of work, and there are lots of types of work that are not offered for work experience, for the examples that she gives. But I think one of the important points of this bill is that many sex workers believe that this bill would make them less safe. Indeed, as one sex worker told the committee, and I quote, "I currently fully vet all of my clients with legal ID and bank transfer deposits. The proposed bill would mean this would be unfeasible. I am safe as I know who I am encountering, but criminalising clients means only those who are willing to break the law will seek out services and therefore be less compliant with my current safety measures." Amnesty International has documented the impact of end demand legislation on the human rights of sex workers in Norway, Ireland and France, and found that it compromises sex workers' safety by involving them in criminalisation as police look for clients, or it criminalises third parties, such as landlords. Evidence from other countries show that making sex work less visible does not eliminate demand. It merely pushes sex workers further underground, increasing their vulnerability to violence and abuse. Workers are forced into more precarious interactions in less safe locations, with less ability to demand safer working conditions or agree on boundaries. That is not protection. That is punishment. This is even more likely with this bill, because it does not decriminalise brothel keeping, defined as where more than one sex worker works in the same place. Not permitting sex workers to legally work together indoors has the effect of making sex workers more isolated, more vulnerable to potential violence. In other words, more at risk of harm. And sex workers will be more unsafe, not just from violent clients, but from stigma and the associated harms of that stigma. The stigma associated with prostitution prevents sex workers getting appropriate healthcare, and criminalisation will stigmatise workers as well as clients. Evidence from around the world has shown a clear link between criminalisation and sex workers' increased risk of HIV, STIs and poor emotional health. That's why experts who have experienced the Nordic model support decriminalisation. Researchers from the LSE conducted 210 formal interviews with sex workers, police, social workers and policymakers in Sweden, Norway and Finland. Of these, 96% opposed the sex buyer laws in those countries. The research found that even without direct criminalisation of sex workers are de facto penalised through the enforcement of intersecting immigration, third-party and fiscal policies. It finds that policing still targets sex workers, with ramifications including evictions and deportations. I do want to address the issue of the trafficking of people for sex work. Trafficking people to force them into sex work is reprehensible, but we do not need new law to tackle that. That law already exists. As the English Collective of Prostitutes have said, and I quote, "We have to look at the effectiveness of the law in that regard and the effectiveness of the support for victims of trafficking, but that is completely unconnected to the question of criminalising clients." The committee heard that there is no evidence from Sweden or other countries that criminalise the purchase of sex that such laws have an impact on trafficking. We can and should crack down on traffickers, but we can do that without harassing people who are just trying to earn a living. And there is another way. As sex workers themselves have said, full decriminalisation of sex work, of purchase and of running locations where sex work happens can create the space for collective safety. It allows sex workers to work together, to unionise, to support one another, to access healthcare, housing and social security, and to work in safe spaces without the looming threat of being dragged into criminal justice processes. Scotland for Decrim argues that only by fully removing punitive laws do sex workers gain, and I quote, "the power to choose when and how we work." The power and the dignity of their labour that all other workers should have. Sex workers are simply asking for that same treatment. As a Scottish Green, I'm concluding, Presiding Officer, as a Scottish Green, I believe deeply in harm reduction, social justice and bodily autonomy. Where sex work happens between consenting adults, I believe the state should support people, not penalise them for how they choose to live and work.
You do need to conclude.
We must trust sex workers with their own lives. We must listen to them and we must follow their demands. We stand for sex workers' rights in Scotland, for safety, dignity and freedom. I appreciate their efforts to hear from a wide range of witnesses, those who share my view on this bill, as well as those who strongly and sincerely support the legislation. And to all those witnesses, I am very grateful to you for sharing your sometimes painful and harrowing stories, for speaking candidly of your experiences, and for making your voices heard. I want to address some of the points raised this afternoon. Firstly, that of the apparent lack of evidence that the Nordic model does not cause harm. Norway criminalised clients in 2009. Amnesty International's 2016 research found that sex workers are still criminalised, including for working together for safety, and they face forced evictions, investigations, surveillance, prosecutions and increased stigma, with migrant workers particularly targeted. And 2022 research found that Nordic model legislation was a smokescreen for punitive and racialised policing, where sex workers were targeted for deportations and evictions. In France, which criminalised clients in 2016, Médecins du Monde's 2018 report found that since the law was introduced, 63% of sex workers have experienced deterioration of their living conditions, more isolation and greater stress. 42% are more exposed to violence, sexual violence, theft and armed robbery. 38% have found it increasingly hard to demand use of condoms. That sounds like pretty clear evidence to me. Turning to the matter of enforcement, when we create new crimes, we must be sure that they are not only justified, but workable. Evidence presented to the committee calls this into question. Whilst I accept Police Scotland supports the bill, Detective Superintendent Bertram's evidence to the committee showed that the police are not yet clear on how they would be able to tell if a crime had happened. And they raised the issue of capacity, as he reported that Police Scotland also struggled to respond to all reports of brothel keeping, never mind an entirely new offence. The Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service said that it can foresee difficulty in proving the accused intention in circumstances where the offence takes place off-street and where there is no admission. In such cases, whilst the Crown Office would not wish to add to the trauma experienced by those exploited by prostitution, their evidence may be required to prove the accused intention. This echoes sex workers' concerns that they will inevitably be dragged into investigations in order for the purchase offence to be proven. Ash Regan therefore wants us to introduce a crime that the police and our prosecution service do not know how they will investigate or prosecute. Moving to some of the other parts of the bill. It is clear that Greens do not support the primary purpose of this bill, but there are parts that, guided by sex workers, we would support. Greens would welcome, for instance, the abolition of the offence of solicitation. As National Ugly Mugs have said, repeal would reduce stigma and criminalisation, improve access to justice and help to build trust between sex workers and Police Scotland. It follows that we should indeed quash any historical offences. We know from evidence given by Scotland Footy Crim that, and I quote, having a criminal record with prostitution-related convictions and or a police warning makes it much more difficult for people to leave sex work. Employers are likely to rescind offers of employment, or the worker can be barred from certain forms of employment if they have to undergo a Disclosure Scotland check. With 10,459 people having been convicted under the soliciting offence since 1982, that would be a major piece of work, but important work to undo a major injustice. But the main aim of this bill, Presiding Officer, is something we cannot support. I cannot support a proposal that people with lived experience, yes, people with an interest in this proposed legislation, have told us will make them more vulnerable, will put them at risk of further harm, will create additional stigma. I hosted an event with Scotland Footy Crim in Parliament last year, and sex workers then were clear. This bill will make them more isolated, more stigmatised, more at risk. It will push already marginalised people further into the shadows. It will empower traffickers and abusers who will be able to capitalise on those forced underground. And it will make sex workers who need help less likely or able to seek help and support. Presiding Officer, criminalisation is not a gift of protection. It is a threat to the rights of working people. Scotland Footy Crim makes the case for safety, not criminalisation, for rights, not rescue. And I will close with the words of a sex worker currently working in Scotland. As someone who does sex work in Scotland, I find the prostitution bill deeply offensive. In 2024, it is standard procedure to give the people you are legislating a voice. It is patronising. It is based on sensationalist stereotypes of sex work. Sex workers in Scotland have been organising for workers' rights for years. We are well informed. The Nordic model is harmful to workers. We have clear demands, full decriminalisation. We are resilient and organised people, not powerless victims, as we are portrayed in this proposal. Thank you.